On these journeys, they really did have to rely on the hospitality of strangers. But it's a little-known fact that the disciples had something to offer in return. There was no formal health system in first-century Galilee. Villagers depended on local healers who had developed home cures that seemed to work. Jesus had a big reputation as a healer, but so too did his disciples.
If they went to a village, they seemed to have two.
That the disciples could heal should not come as a surprise. Faith healing has a long history. For centuries, it was the only healing people had.
It's not at all.
In part, thanks to their ability to heal, Jesus and the disciples began to attract larger and larger crowds. But for all the good work the disciples did, healing could be a deeply frustrating experience. The Bible tells us that sometimes they just couldn't do it.
In the Gospel of Matthew, there's a story of a man who brings...
If the disciples did leave everything behind to follow Jesus, even something as fundamental as finding food could be a problem. There's a clue in the Bible as to how they fed themselves. In one story, they are said to take grain from a field. This may sound as though the disciples turned into thieves, but Jewish law made provision for the poor, including travelers.
If you have a...
They left. They never returned.
We have a number of...
Jesus may have gone home at night.
To have tea with his mother-in-law. And so that gives the impression that maybe the break, at least in the early period when Jesus' ministry was located in Galilee, maybe the break wasn't quite so clear-cut as we're often led to believe.
As Jesus' ministry grew, occasions when the disciples...
his son to Jesus. Well, Jesus does heal the son. Later on, the disciples come and say, well, why couldn't we do it? What was the problem? And Jesus says, it was your lack of faith.
Symptomatic of a more fundamental problem. To have complete faith in Jesus as a leader, the disciples needed to share his vision. And for much of the time, they appeared to do so. Disciples out. Instead of acting with humility, the disciples were furious. It was a flagrant breach of Jesus' teaching on loving your enemies. James and John were so angry, they wanted to send down fire on the village and obliterate it.
I think today we would see this.
Whereas Jesus says, no, that's not the way he works. He'll offer them salvation, but if they don't accept it, that's up to them.
The disciples were not just at odds with Jesus. Which of them is the greatest? James... Expensive perfume over Jesus. The
disciples are annoyed that this woman has wasted this oil.
As treasurer of the group, Judas seems particularly upset by this act. Every group has disagreements, but the consequences of Judas's reaction were catastrophic. The Gospels of Mark and Matthew say
God's salvation of his people, so it's a very volatile time. It's a time when everybody is at the peak of excitement.
The highlight of the festival was a shared meal later that same week. But as they settled down to eat what has become known as the Last Supper, Jesus was unusually subdued. It's not clear why the disciples didn't understand what Jesus was talking about. Perhaps all along they had just been waiting for some kind of uprising. the death of their leader was not part of the plan. But what happens next seals their fate. Events that would lead to Jesus' crucifixion. He makes his fatal deal with the authorities. He agrees to betray Jesus. In return, he gets 30 pieces of silver.
Everybody knew who Jesus was.
Not much for someone who would come to be worshipped as the Son of God. But Judas nonetheless accepts the money. He leads the guards to where he knows the group will be. Suddenly, everything they had worked towards begins to unravel. The disciples panic and lash out.
Connection there. When they rent that,
Were left utterly depressed and broken.
So together again in the upper room. They've got the doors firmly shut because they're worried about the Jewish authorities. And suddenly, Jesus appears in the room and says, "Peace be with you."
Crucial for the survival of the movement. It's become known as Pentecost. Since that appearance, they had been
They see the Holy Spirit like little flames of fire resting above.
Experiment means that we have to take seriously the idea that religious remarkable transformation. On the surface, it seemed to be simply a psychological shift. But if Judas didn't want to betray Jesus, there still must have been a reason for his deal with the authorities.
I think one thing we could suggest is that
As their leader was crucified, it isn't clear where the disciples went.
they could.
Within days of Jesus' execution, there were stories of him rising from the dead. Maybe this was what kept the disciples going.